The tragic fate of George Drulard, a frontier legend. In the vast and seemingly infinite wilderness of what is now Montana, the Jefferson River once meandered through untouched landscapes. The river, named after Thomas Jefferson, was not just a physical feature. It embodied the deep complexities of the 19th century American frontier. It was a place where European explorers, fur trappers, and indigenous peoples navigated, traded, and occasionally fought for dominance. The river was a symbol of both the promise and the peril of the American frontier. It was along these waters that George Drulard, one of the most fascinating and tragic figures of this period, met his end. Drulard's death in 1810, at the hands of the Blackfoot Confederacy, marked the end of a journey that had seen him rise from a mixed-race youth with a promising future to a legendary frontiersman and an invaluable member of the Lewis and Clark expedition. But it also signified the tension between two worlds, one of growing American expansion and the other of indigenous sovereignty. In this untamed heart of the Jefferson River, the broader forces of exploration, trade, and cultural resistance collided in a violent climax that would forever shape Drulard's legacy. The Jefferson River itself had become a crossroads of sorts, a meeting point where Euro-American ambitions of conquest intersected with the ancient traditions of the Blackfoot and other native tribes who had long called the region home. While the river provided essential resources like water, fish, and fertile land for agriculture, it was also the artery through which the tides of history were shifting. The exploration and expansionist ambitions of the United States were pushing westward, motivated by the doctrine of manifest destiny. These movements, however, were not without significant resistance, particularly from the indigenous tribes who had long inhabited these lands and had cultivated a deep connection with the natural environment that the settlers sought to subdue. Thus, the story of George Drulard unfolds not only as a personal tragedy, but also as part of a larger narrative about the transformative forces shaping the American frontier. It is a story of exploration, violence, cultural misunderstanding, and the enduring fight for control over land and resources. A frontier in flux. The context of Drulard's era. To understand the significance of George Drulard's death and his place in the history of the American frontier, one must first understand the broader historical context of the early 19th century. This was a time of monumental change, driven by expansionist ambitions, economic forces, and intense geopolitical competition. The United States, having recently emerged from its war for independence, was eager to extend its reach westward. The Louisiana Purchase of 1803, which effectively doubled the size of the country, opened up vast and largely unexplored territories to the young nation. This acquisition, largely motivated by President Thomas Jefferson's vision of an agrarian republic, would have profound consequences, not just for the United States, but for the indigenous nations that had lived on these lands for centuries. In the years following the Louisiana Purchase, settlers, traders, and explorers flooded into the newly acquired lands, but these territories were far from empty. Indigenous peoples such as the Blackfoot Confederacy had lived in these regions for thousands of years. Their societies were intricately tied to the land, the animals, and the rhythms of nature. The arrival of settlers and fur trappers disrupted these societies in numerous ways, both directly and indirectly. The expansionist impulses of the United States, reinforced by its growing economic interests in the fur trade, created tensions between the U.S. government, its settlers, and the indigenous populations. The fur trade, which had long been an economic staple for European settlers and indigenous peoples alike, was the driving force behind much of this expansion. The demand for beaver pelts, particularly for European fashion, led to a rush to exploit the natural resources of the western frontier. Fur companies like the Missouri Fur Company, which George Drulard joined in the early 1800s, sought to establish monopolies over the fur trade by encroaching into territories that had been long occupied by indigenous nations. These movements were met with increasing resistance, particularly from powerful groups like the Blackfoot Confederacy, who sought to protect their lands and way of life. However, this resistance was often portrayed in the context of a larger struggle between the forces of European American civilization and the so-called savagery of indigenous peoples. But for the Blackfoot and other indigenous groups, this was not simply a matter of cultural differences. It was a matter of survival. The fur trade was not just an economic competition. It was an existential threat to their autonomy, their way of life, and their relationship with the land. The life of George Droulard, a man between worlds. George Droulard was born in 1773 in Detroit, Michigan, to a French-Canadian father, Pierre Droulard, and a Shawnee mother. His mixed heritage set him apart in many ways, making him a man who straddled two worlds, those of his French-Canadian and Indigenous roots. His father, a soldier, fur trader, and interpreter, instilled in George the importance of language and cultural understanding. His mother, a Shawnee woman, introduced him to the traditions and wisdom of indigenous peoples. Together, they gave him a unique perspective on the frontier and the diverse cultures that coexisted there. From an early age, George Droulard exhibited remarkable skills that would serve him well in the wilds of the American West. He became an expert hunter-trapper and tracker, but perhaps his most valuable skill was his fluency in multiple languages. Droulard could speak French, English, Shawnee, and the sign language that was used as a lingua franca among many of the indigenous peoples of the Great Plains. This ability to communicate across cultural lines would make him an invaluable asset to the Lewis and Clark expedition. At the time of the Lewis and Clark expedition in 1804, the United States was still a young country, seeking to solidify its claims to the vast territories acquired through the Louisiana Purchase. The expedition, led by Meriwether Lewis and William Clark, was tasked with exploring these new lands, mapping out uncharted territory, and establishing peaceful relations with the indigenous peoples they encountered. Droulard joined the expedition as a hunter and interpreter, and his contributions were pivotal to its success. Droulard's skill as a tracker and hunter ensured that the expedition had food and supplies, while his diplomatic skills helped to foster goodwill with various indigenous nations. He was often sent ahead of the group as a scout and played a key role in navigating the difficult terrain. Despite his contributions, however, Droulard's name did not carry the same recognition as that of Lewis or Clark, and he remained in the shadows of history. This overshadowing of Droulard is reflective of the broader historical narrative that often minimizes the contributions of indigenous peoples and those of mixed descent. The allure and dangers of the fur trade. The fur trade was a complex and often dangerous industry that drew men like George Droulard into its fold. By 1810, Droulard had left the service of Lewis and Clark the fur trade full-time. He joined the Missouri Fur Company, which was led by Manuel Lisa, a prominent fur trader who sought to expand his business into the rugged regions of the Rocky Mountains. Droulard, with his extensive knowledge of the land, his linguistic abilities, and his expertise as a tracker, was a natural fit for the job. The fur trade was a perilous occupation. It required men to venture deep into hostile and unpredictable territories, where they would face dangers from wild animals, harsh weather, and often indigenous groups who viewed the fur trade as an intrusion. These men, known as mountain men, often operated in isolation, relying on their wits, their skills, and their knowledge of the land to survive. However, their very presence was a source of tension. The Blackfoot, in particular, saw these trappers as a threat to their way of life. As the fur trade expanded, competition between fur companies intensified, and violence became a more common feature of life on the frontier. The Blackfoot Confederacy, which controlled much of the territory where the fur trade was booming, had long resisted European and American encroachment. They were a formidable force, known for their military prowess and their ability to defend their lands. To the Blackfoot, the trappers were not simply traders. They were invaders, stealing resources and destabilizing the delicate ecological balance of the region. For George Droulard, this meant operating in a dangerous environment. As a seasoned trapper, he knew the risks involved. But his independent nature often led him to push forward into areas where others dared not venture. His fateful journey along the Jefferson River in 1810, where he was ultimately killed by Blackfoot warriors, is a testament to the inherent dangers of the fur trade and the growing conflict between indigenous sovereignty and American expansionism. The Blackfoot Confederacy, guardians of the plains. The Blackfoot Confederacy was one of the most powerful and influential indigenous groups in the northern Great Plains. Composed of the Siksika-Kainai and Piikani nations, the Confederacy controlled vast territories that stretched across what is now Montana, Alberta, and Saskatchewan. The Blackfoot had a deep spiritual connection to the land and the animals that inhabited it, particularly the bison. These creatures were central to their way of life, providing food, clothing, shelter, and tools. The Blackfoot were also expert horsemen and warriors, skilled in both diplomacy and combat. When the United States began to push westward, the Blackfoot saw the arrival of settlers, traders, and trappers as a direct threat to their survival. The fur trade disrupted their traditional hunting grounds, and the influx of European goods, including guns and metal tools, disrupted the balance of power among indigenous groups. The Blackfoot were determined to defend their territory, and they waged a long-standing campaign against those who sought to exploit their resources. The tensions between the Blackfoot and the fur traders were not merely economic, but also cultural and existential. The Blackfoot saw the fur trade as an attack on their sovereignty, their way of life, and their relationship with the land. To them, the trappers were not innocent traders. They were symbols of a much larger threat, an invading force that sought to impose a foreign way of life on their land. The final expedition in the spring of 1810, George Drulard set out on his final journey, hoping to trap along the Jefferson River. It was a familiar route for Drulard, one he had traveled many times during his years in the fur trade. But this time, there was a dangerous undercurrent to his journey. The Blackfoot were known to be hostile to outsiders, particularly trappers who ventured too far into their territory. Drulard, however, was undeterred by the risks. He trusted in his abilities, his knowledge of the land, and his understanding of indigenous peoples to guide him safely through this perilous terrain. When he failed to return to camp after several days, his companions grew concerned. A search party was dispatched, and after a few days of searching, they found Drulard's body near a creek. It was clear that he had been ambushed by Blackfoot warriors. The circumstances surrounding his death remain shrouded in mystery, but it is widely believed that he was killed in a struggle with his attackers. The scene suggested that Drulard had fought bravely, but had ultimately been overwhelmed. His death was a tragic loss both for his companions and for the broader frontier community. George Drulard was not just a skilled trapper and hunter. He was a bridge between cultures. His understanding of the indigenous peoples of the West, his linguistic abilities, and his deep knowledge of the land made him an invaluable asset. His passing marked the end of an era, one in which the frontier was still a place of opportunity, but also one of great risk and uncertainty. A life cut short, a legacy remembered. George Drummond's legacy has often been overshadowed by the larger-than-life figures of Lewis and Clark. However, his contributions were no less significant. He played a vital role in the success of the Lewis and Clark expedition, and his skills and knowledge helped to ensure that the expedition survived the challenges of the frontier. His death in 1810, while tragic, underscored the dangers of the frontier and the complex relationships between Americans and indigenous peoples. Though Drulard may not have achieved the fame of Lewis or Clark, his life is a testament to the hardships, challenges, and complexities of life on the frontier. He was a man who understood both the European and indigenous worlds and navigated between them with skill and finesse. His death, caught between the forces of American expansion and indigenous resistance, was a tragic but fitting end for a man who had spent his life on the edge of both worlds. Expanding the legacy, broader themes and lessons, the story of George Drulard extends far beyond the life of one individual. His life and death illustrate the broader conflicts and contradictions that define the American frontier. Drulard's mixed heritage, his service to both the U.S. government and indigenous groups, and his untimely death at the hands of the Blackfoot all speak to the larger issues of land power and identity that shaped the history of the American West. At its heart, Drulard's story is about the collision of cultures, one of expansion and one of resistance. It is about the exploitation of natural resources and the disruption of indigenous ways of life. It is about the tension between economic opportunity and cultural survival. These themes are not merely historical. They continue to resonate in the modern world. Droulard's legacy invites us to consider the consequences of imperialism, colonization, and the exploitation of natural resources. It challenges us to reflect on the cost of progress and the price of ambition. His story reminds us that the history of the American frontier was not just written by those who expanded westward, but by the indigenous peoples who fought to preserve their lands and way of life. A tragic hero of the frontier, George Droulard's life and death stand as a poignant symbol of the contradictions that define the American frontier. His story is one of bravery, resilience, and tragedy, but it is also a story about the broader forces of history, forces that shape the land, its people, and the future of a nation. As we look back on his life, we are reminded of the challenges of the frontier, the complexities of cultural exchange, and the profound impact of westward expansion on indigenous peoples. In the end, George Droulard's story is not just the tale of one man's journey, but a reflection of the larger history of the American West. His life serves as a reminder of the complex and multifaceted nature of history, and of the enduring legacy of those who lived on the margins of society. His tragic death, while a loss to those who knew him, serves as a fitting end to a life defined by the pursuit of survival, knowledge, and understanding in a world that was rapidly changing.